think it's time to call the evening to order, 5:59, and I appreciate all of you who have come this evening to tonight's talk and during the first week of the opening of the show, Maya Hidden Worlds Revealed. I really want to thank Vice President Dalia Guerra, who is in charge of these kinds of public engagement things that go on here and making this possible this evening. Tonight, our speaker, Dr. Ronald Bishop from the Smithsonian Institution, the Department of Anthropology in the American Museum of Natural History. He serves there as a senior research archaeologist and as the curator for Mexican and Central American archaeology. You're going to hear a really fascinating and textured view of the work that has taken place in Mesoamerica over the past better part of 50 years, I would say. We met with a drop telephone call, and he said, "You don't know who I am." And I said, "No, I don't." Well, after 20 years of working together in a book and a number of articles, and God, more reports than you can shake a stick at, we've created a fast friendship, and it is a unusual and great honor to be able to bring a friend like this here, not just because he's my friend, but also because he's working with one of my other dear friends here on campus, Dr. Juan Gonzalez from the Geology in the SEAMS program. So tonight and all day today and tomorrow, we have a series of talks that are taking place that are being funded by the Office of the Vice President or Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs and Diversity, the School of Art, the College of Fine Arts, the College of Liberal Arts, the College of Sciences, SHPGEO National Science Foundation funded educational project, the Houston Endowment for Civic Engagement, the CHAPS program, that's the Community Historical Archaeology Project for Schools program, and the UTRGV Government and Community Relations. This is indeed a great honor to again have Dr. Bishop speak with us this evening, and I hope you will take the time to enjoy the exhibit and most of all, welcome him. Thank you, Dr. Bishop.
I started off in chemistry, went into anthropology, got interested in my professor's work with chemical analyses of pottery, that is, working on the data, and by chance got an opportunity to be trained in a technique called neutron activation. First of all, I was in the low man on the totem pole. Wrong analogy, actually. It's the low man that's holding up everything. But anyway, that fact aside, I got to run my samples at night because other people were using the equipment during the day. But at night, as soon as everybody left, was when things broke down. So in desperation, I learned how to work with the equipment, fix it, calibrate it, get involved with the technique, and on until I started going back to Brookhaven. So I was at Brookhaven National Laboratory essentially for 9 years, and of extended postdocs and contract work, and then was hired by the Smithsonian to capitalize on the database that I had created and the kind of program that I was doing. My old friend from Brookhaven became my director at the Smithsonian, pulled me off of my database work, and said, "I want you to create some programs." Okay, where? He said, "I don't care. I just want them to be anthropologically relevant." Well, gee, with that kind of a mandate, I've had 33 years of absolutely uninterrupted research, much of which has contributed to databases in the Southwest, California, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, but principally in the Maya. The Maya ceramics were what really attracted me because you could do so much with pottery as a material to trace lifeways, to look at growth of complex civilizations, to look at trade, economics, political power. And these are objects from museums. Sometimes they're known generally where to come from, such as this vessel, but where they came from. But in other cases, these are the ooh and ah objects of a museum. Ooh, so pretty. Que linda. On and on. But they're isolated. They have no context. They're just an independent art object. And I thought that with the work that I was doing with activation analysis in the Palenque area, where we had been able to chemically identify different zones that produced the pottery to work out on work out their trading patterns, why not create a database of excavated or old museum collections across the whole Maya world and be able to project these isolated objects onto that chemical map. That way you could have a body of themes, hieroglyphic texts, design styles, and you would know where they came from or general areas. Now there are recent artifacts that play into this whole game. This is a nice artifact as a monument. And as you walk across the ground in New Mexico, if you look down under your feet, you'll feel the crunch of glass. And the world changed in 1945. Which, of course, was the first test of nuclear power. Robert Oppenheimer was the father of the atomic bomb. And it's interesting in many aspects. Oppenheimer was a pacifist, but he worked on the project to develop one of the most destructive weapons that we know of. And after the explosion, and the scientists recognized what it was they had developed. First of all, in their mind, it was to stop the aggression of Germany. According to the people I worked with that were old Manhattan Project scientists, they were sure Germany had the bomb. So the rush was not to first deploy it, but rather to limit the damage that was done. Oppenheimer asked whether or not there would be a use of the newfound power for peaceful applications. Ultimately, Eisenhower signed the Atoms for Peace program, and for a while, any idea you had about the use of nuclear power for peaceful situations was loved. And the old Manhattan scientists that were here included Dick Dodson, who was the first director of the Department of Chemistry at Brookhaven National Lab. And he was there, and Oppenheimer asked him whether or not he thought this would be worthwhile. They were at a cocktail party after Christmas, spending the time, the Oppenheimers and the Dodsons together, and just kicking back with a after-dinner drink, threw this out. And there was the response was, well, I don't know. So a meeting was held at the Princeton Center for Advanced Study, and attended by Dodson, Oppenheimer, and a couple of archaeologists. And a young archaeologist that was there, Edward Sayre, was asked to take on the task of trying to see whether neutron activation could be used for archaeology. Now that's just about as peaceful as you get, although the tenure wars these days and department politics notwithstanding, it gets a little difficult. But that aside, the basic principle is that things contain elements. Elements have nuclei. That a material exposed to an incoming cloud of neutrons, produced usually by a nuclear reactor, renders the sample radioactive. In order for that sample to come to a more stable state, it gives off different particles, one of which is a gamma ray. These gamma rays can be counted, separated according to their energy, and quantified. And if you irradiate your samples with standards of known concentration, you then simply ratio the two to get an idea of how many parts per million of a whole range of elements are in your sample. That becomes a chemical fingerprint. And like fingerprints, after that, it's a computer game to match up the fingerprints. So we have ceremonial centers, I like to think, of two different sorts. One, the ancient Maya, and two, the gods of science at Brookhaven. And this is a mythological person. No, Ed Sayre was the one who first applied it. Gar Harbottle was Linus Pauling's brightest student who was asked to participate in lunar projects. And he said, nah, I want to work on archaeology with Sayre. So these were my mentors at Brookhaven. And the general overall scheme: take a sample, irradiate it, count it, and you get a gamma spectra. And this can be quantified, and that is your fingerprint. Now, the first applications were quite simple. Could you, with chemistry, tell the difference between Aztec pottery and Maya pottery? Now, any art historian, even at the beginning of their career, is going to look at it and be able to render that answer, or archaeology. But that wasn't the issue. The issue is the methodological development. And this methodological development went on from around 1952 for the first application to around 1971. And several things happened then at that time. Computers were developed. You could cut your time to a fraction of what it required before to obtain your data. Computers could do statistics. You had better counting equipment, the gamma detection, greater efficiency. Everything was developing, and it was all in place at Brookhaven with brand new material, brand new equipment when I went there in 1973. It was the perfect time for an archaeologist to come in and pose anthropological questions rather than seeing how to develop the technique. And in point of fact, from that time on, there has been relatively small change in anything that we do. It became rote and it became applied. You could actually do archaeology, anthropology with the developments. Now, that means that you have to pick a decent sample. Sample selection is the crux of much of this. In the early 1970s, an early application came up with all these beautiful groups. There were 125 samples that were analyzed very expensively. Then a PhD out of Oxford wrote his dissertation on a particular program for putting patterns together, and he came up with all these different groups. Now, of course, being a pre-PhD at the time in 1973, when I got to Brookhaven, I had access to this data. And I could code the data for its paste differences. That is, these were fine paste, no temper. These were volcanic ash. These were of carbonates. So basically, what he showed after 2 years of computer work, after a year's work of getting the data, you could do the same thing with a binocular microscope in a couple of hours. Sample selection. How good are your samples for answering, and do you need a technique like activation to answer the question? Or do you need a nuclear reactor for that matter? Then there's communication. You're describing what you're doing to your colleagues. And it could be an archaeologist, or it could be a white-coated scientist. And you run up to them excitedly talking about Mahal Novus and the great findings of Ramakrishna Rao and the other mathematics that are used. And the reaction is usually, then in a more gentle way, is how you communicate with your peers in your own discipline. And I had this cartoon commissioned based on my ideas by Bob Humphrey, now gone. But the archaeologist discovers in the field a burial. and artifacts, and has a particular idea about what it constitutes. So he puts it through, say, activation analysis, goes in the magic hopper, costly, churning it out. Turns out that then you go to the mainframe computer. Maya fine paste ceramics were one of the first applications, and I've worked with this for 40 years. These were thought to be associated with the Maya collapse, the abandonment of the great cities of the Central Patan around 800 AD, more or less. Lots of details, lots of debates, but it formed a very nice thing because these were fine paste and you didn't have the problem of temper or other materials being added to the clays to make the pottery. These were natural sediments. So we could actually study these sediments relative to the rivers that we assigned them to. And we were able to come up with very detailed characterizations. We analyzed a few samples and were able to attribute the main manufacturing zone here from the Rio Usumacinta, and actually characterizing everything from up here all the way down the river, and this was the main manufacturing zone. And so we turned from the fine paste project to looking at the polychrome ceramics, and Bob Smith was the leading ceramicist of the time, associated with Harvard projects. And Bob Smith offered the suggestion that there may have been 7 centers of Maya polychrome production in the Maya lowlands. That, when I went to Brookhaven, was the idea that there were only 7. We now know if you have a bump on the ground, and they were making pottery somewhere around it. So this gave me a great deal of zeal to try to use the neutron activation to show that there were more areas. We'll skip that one, just theoretical background. Now, here's the idea of a project. You can do this. How do you continue to do it? If you're there at Brookhaven for 3 months, you can only do a few samples. If you're there for a year, you can do a lot more. But I wanted a lot. So fortunately, we could develop the project. The timeline started with Palenque pottery, went to the fine paste, had some work on jade for a number of years, started in 79, started an aggressive sampling program of the major collections in the U.S. Moving through, and anytime you want to do this kind of work, you got to find a sugar daddy. Landon Clay, deceased very recently, was a Boston banker, and he loved jade. And he was one of the main backers of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. So through the Museum of Fine Arts, I was funded for several years to develop the database. And then other museums got involved. Conversations with Linda Sheely at the University of Texas. I couldn't work with Sheely, she couldn't work with me, but the idea was if she had a student who would be interested in the pottery, she'd send them to me. And ultimately, Dory Retz-Burdett came back, and fine, it worked out. We had a great time. We saw we could do this project, but she was in school. She still had 2 years to go in her doctoral work. So fortunately, another individual, a Wichita oil man, came into the picture who liked to take pictures of some of my objects, and he plunked up the money for 2 years of her school to finish up her doctorate, working with the data I had generated. And Dory and I have been working together ever since. So how do you get an oil man to really loosen up the money? These are things that you just don't know. Russ, you know this fine fellow.
I think I do. Yeah.
All these guys have a club. And you go to the club about 4 o'clock in the afternoon until you can crawl out. And my ability at one time was much greater than today. And at the end of an evening, he says, "Boy, I'd like to help this project." I said, "I've got a person for you to fund." And that began Dora Rensburnet's career working with me on the project. We look a little bit different then. You'll notice the TV monitor now found in the room of technology at the Smithsonian. Now, we've analyzed sites throughout the Maya area. These are the most heavily sampled sites. There's 150 other sites that I have projected on here. But ultimately, what you have is a level of description. All this gives you is a concentration of certain elements that are in the sample. And you have to do something with that. Number. You sample varying size collections from university and museum collections to, in Guatemala City, a person who had a few samples that she liked. You have to be aware of the different tempers, volcanic ash, carbonates, medium sands. You don't want to try to compare vessels that are tempered with one kind of temper with another. That's like comparing the chemistry of walnuts and oranges. They're going to be different. If you can see they're different, they will be different. And you have to look at racial relations rather than just absolute magnitude. The question I always give students that come back to work with me is, what is more similar, the mouse, the rat, or the squirrel? And ultimately, looking at this, they'll give me an answer in terms of, the rat and the squirrel, in terms of size, are certainly more similar. But size isn't necessarily an important thing. It's the shape. The elemental profile is a shape. So the mouse and the rat are almost identical in shape. So this has to be brought into consideration. We're going to look here at sites in Kamanohuyu, Copan, and move very quickly through where did the pottery come from in the tombs at Copan? A great site, early ruler, early classic. We can form compositional groups. We can analyze the pottery from the tomb and project it onto our background to say where it came from. And we can refute particular ideas. They thought that perhaps the founder of Copan came from Kamanohuyu in the Guatemalan highlands, except no pottery from the Guatemalan highlands is found in the tombs. So that didn't work well. Other sites, you can do modeling within a site, not between sites, but within a site, such as looking at compositional group differences here at Tikal. And that should have gone out. Ultimately, we are able to see the difference between pottery made here in Mundo Perdido, part of Tikal, versus the central Tikal itself. And that gives you a lot of specificity as you're looking at change in ceramic production. We can look at similarity among vessels. Here you have a bunch of little cylinders. They were found together. And you're not going to have to read this. But if you look at the analytical data, you'll see they are very similar in composition. They were probably made in the same workshop. You can match up samples from unknowns. This is an excavated lid from Copan that is similar in composition to a museum piece. Now, I'm not saying at this point where either of these come from, but you can pull these two together. I wrote a screening algorithm that allows you to go through the database and pull out similarities. And here was one of our best successes. In the 1970s, thousands, perhaps hyperbole, hundreds of codex-style vessels poured out of a town called Carmelita. And they flooded into the art market, into the New York living rooms, all through the country. These vessels just cropped up, and they're wonderful. Fine whiplash black line on a cream background, well controlled. And you have dynasty pots that have hieroglyphic discussions of the rise of different rulers. And you have a lot of just fun scenes. Notice the commonality of the rims, and you have more checkerboards, dancing figures, quite a range. Again, all said to be from Carmelita. Well, they weren't from Carmelita. That's where the looters brought the pieces to sell to the middlemen. And so all of these at this time were non-provenience. We had no idea where in the archaeological record they occurred. The excavations had not taken place yet. But we're now able to see these come from one particular subregion. You have the difference between Mirador and Nakbe. You can form groups and look at where the pieces come from different tombs. Oh, that's the same one. Oh, it's nice to screen your slides first. So these come from a different area, from the site of Calakmul itself, not in the Mirador Basin where that other pottery came from. So we're getting pretty good with this, and Aaron and I just sampled another 150 of these vessels when we were in Guatemala last. That will be added to the fray. Now, a question earlier today is, can we see anything about styles? And I talked about idiosyncratic expression of styles and differences. Here's a good case. These two vessels come from the Art Institute in Chicago. And my art historian colleague thought that the same hand had painted both of the glyph bands. Now, she's got a pretty good eye, but, all right. Different styles, different types would be treated differently by the archaeologists. So I analyzed both of them. And you probably can't read, but if you go through the first two here, if I had analyzed the same vessel twice, I couldn't have data any closer. 2 years later, she was looking at a vessel in a private collection. We got permission to take a sample because she thought it was the same hand that she saw on these other glyph bands. And while it is not as similar as these two are to each other, it's certainly from the same workshop. Now, this really throws a wrench in a lot of archaeological interpretations where you look at styles and talk about, oh, this group made that style, this group made that style. Now, there's some workshop pumping out dramatically different stylistic vessels. The only thing they share is they're all three cylinders, but they are compositionally the same workshop. Where you sample, where the sites are located influences how you work with the chemistry. We've gone from karst terrain to transition from hillside to plains, from the swampy terrains to heavily vegetated areas, or even the island in Flores. All of these have different problems and affect the chemistry in different ways. And you have to look at not only the elemental abundance, but the association, how different groups of elements work with each other. And that's been one of the really fun things that I've had to do, is to work out this puzzle of associations. And do they signal something more than just the elemental abundances? And the answer is usually yep. Then we move to the end with a consequence of long duration research. First of all, you accumulate a lot of data. It's easier to accumulate data than it is to interpret it. And then, God forbid, you have to write it up. That takes even longer. But now you've gotten, Erin and I have a lot of colleagues. Michelle had samples that she sent to me. We had figurines. All the stuff is coming in, and they're silent. You never hear anything from us. Sorry, Michelle. And which leads to, who are you? And why is this report dated 1985? You need more samples. Sometimes you can see a pattern start to emerge, and there are 3 steps in it. Think you see a pattern. Convince yourself there is a pattern, and then see how you're going to present it to convince somebody else that it exists. All of this underlies the use of activation analysis, but it is time consuming. So in answer to Oppenheimer's question, was it of use to archaeology? I think we could say yes. And I want to thank in particular Aaron Sears, Jim Blackman, who worked with me at the laboratories, and it's always been a party with the Maya. Thank you very much.